Good day. Today is Saturday, 6 September 2025, and as I did with my programme yesterday, and with apologies, I am going to first deal or discuss the situation in Britain, where the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has conducted a major reshuffle. Now, perhaps saying that it's Keir Starmer who's conducted the reshuffle might be an overstatement. It appears to be mostly the work of his Chief of Staff, Morgan McSweeney, who, as is quite often the case in Britain, by the way, is assumed by many people to be a pivotal figure in the government, somebody who makes enormous decisions and who basically controls what Keir Starmer does. I ought to say that this is a common theme in British politics. I remember when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, it was widely assumed and claimed by many people, including some people who I assumed at the time had good reasons to know what the facts were, that his chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, was the person who was really actually running the government. It turns out in Dominic Cummings' case that was not the case at all. And just to say, he has written about this extensively, and he's provided a series of commentaries which, whatever your personal feelings about Dominic Cummings, and I know many people have strong feelings about Dominic Cummings, feelings which, by the way, I don't myself share. Anyway, whatever your feelings about him, they are very interesting, and they do provide a startling insight into the completely dysfunctional nature of the central government machine in London, and the extent to which it is the permanent bureaucracy rather than the ministers who actually control things and make the decisions. Anyway, I digress. The point about the reshuffle is that it's clearly intended to strengthen the government and to somehow deal with the fallout from the catastrophic resignation yesterday of the Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner. I would say very briefly that the overall effect of the reshuffle is to push the government further still in an even more Blairite direction. And it's likely to isolate two figures in the cabinet, the Finance Minister, Rachel Reeves, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, and the person who's in charge of energy policy, who's seen as by some people as being somewhat to the left of Starmer, Ed Miliband. But anyway, put all that aside. This is unimportant to this programme. The more important thing is that Britain's, in my opinion, totally incompetent, massively ineffective, completely disorganised Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has now been transferred from the Foreign Office and has been given the job of Deputy Prime Minister and is in effect, or at least in theory, number two under Keir Starmer, though it is not clear to me yet what exactly it is that David Lammy is actually going to be doing. Now, in some ways, this has been a good thing. Anybody who's followed the career of David Lammy over the last year will know that he was an utterly ineffective and completely incompetent Foreign Secretary. Like Starmer, he is a lawyer, in fact, a high-profile lawyer, and it seemed to me that when he discussed foreign policy, and nearly all his discussions about foreign policy were, of course, about the perennial obsession both of the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer himself, and of the British establishment in its totality. The focus I'm talking about being Ukraine. Anyway, whenever he talked about the conflict in Ukraine, exactly as you would expect a lawyer to do, he seemed to me to be spending most of his time trying to score points off Vladimir Putin. Now, I never could understand the point of that. Vladimir Putin is not interested in what David Lammy has to say. I couldn't understand what the point of that in public was, doing that in public was. It's Putin is far away in Moscow. He is not interested in any points that David Lammy might have been thinking of scoring off him. Just saying. Anyway, David Lammy then spent an enormous amount of time talking to his friends in Europe, where of course they're all part of the coalition of the willing. But the one thing he didn't ever do that I could see was engage in any serious diplomacy. Serious diplomacy with China, serious diplomacy with the Middle East, serious diplomacy, of course, with Russia, which in some ways is the most pressing issue. One would have thought that by this time, a priority of a British Foreign Secretary would be at least to speak to the Russians at a time when the Americans, ever so hesitatingly, were starting to do so. But no, of course not, scoring points from a distance off Vladimir Putin, who isn't interested and doesn't care. That apparently was a much more important and pressing and interesting thing for David Lammy to do. Now, as I said, I think, well, I'm personally relieved to see David Lammy transferred out of the Foreign Office and made Deputy Prime Minister. The person who's taking his place, however, Yvette Cooper, a veteran Labour politician, again very much from the Blairite wing of the Labour Party, I predict is going to be in substance no different. But anyway, as is always the case, I'm going to defer comment about what she's going to do or not do as Foreign Secretary until I see it actually happen. I don't expect anything different from her, but let's just wait and see. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about these two essentially inconsequential people, David Lammy and Yvette Cooper. But it is happening in Britain. Britain is my country, watching the disintegration of the government in Britain as things get worse and worse. Obviously something that concerns me a lot as a British person. Watching the failure of British diplomacy concerns me still more. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say about it in this programme. Now, over the last couple of hours, we have had a succession of very interesting statements from various people who are intimately involved with the Ukraine crisis. And the one I'm going to start with first is the Deputy Chair of Russia's Security Council, former President and Prime Minister of Russia. In my opinion, one of the most important and powerful people in Russia. I completely disagree with the widely expressed view in the West that Medvedev is some kind of clown. I don't get that sense at all. He is also, after all, the head of the Military Industrial Commission and is the man mostly responsible for this huge increase in military production, which we have seen happen in Russia over the last 3 years. Anyway, Medvedev has just made a comment in response to a question from the Russian media about the coalition of the willing meeting in Paris, the one that Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, Giorgia Meloni, Vladimir Zelensky all attended, and where they talked again about security guarantees and troop deployments to Ukraine and backstops and guarantees from the Americans, all on the assumption that the Americans were prepared to give the backstop, which all the indications suggest they are not, and that the Russians will agree to the deployments, which of course they have said they never will. Anyway, this is what Medvedev had to say about the Coalition of the Willing meeting in Paris. It is partly said in the coarse language that he now consciously adopts, which I'm going to water down. It seems to me that this is all simply inadequate. This is BS. Such heresy is what they're doing, or to put it in English, it's BS, whatever you want to call it. They invent something for themselves there, pull it out of different places, they then present it as a guarantee. It won't have any consequences. That is obvious. To say it again, his actual language was significantly coarser than I am saying. But who realistically, objectively, can deny that he is absolutely right? What we saw in Paris was a classic example of Eve Smith's dictum that in the West we spend all our time in a conflict negotiating with each other, forgetting or overlooking or ignoring the fact that it is the other side that we ought to be negotiating with. And isn't that, in effect, exactly what Medvedev is saying? They invent something for themselves there. They then present it as a guarantee. It won't have any consequences. That is obvious. Now, Medvedev is not the only person saying this. The arch neocon Daily Telegraph commentator, David Blair, who is, by the way, in spite of what I've just said about him, in my opinion, a clever man. Anyway, he has just written this in the Daily Telegraph, and for once, I find myself in complete agreement with him. Trump's peace deal has now gone full circle after nearly 8 months of sound and fury from US President and frenzied diplomacy from European allies. We are back where we started. This is absolutely correct. He's slightly wrong, actually. He says that there's been some progress in discussing security guarantees for Ukraine, but as we've seen, Medvedev says that there's been no progress on that front at all. There is a small amount of progress in one respect, which is that Trump himself has publicly said that he's come round to the Russian view that there is not going to be a ceasefire before there is a negotiation, a serious negotiation to settle the war. So that is progress of a kind, but of course it is not especially significant progress, and no one should think so. The war goes on, and as I discussed in my program yesterday, Vladimir Putin, in his various statements and comments made in China and made at the forum in the Far East, has basically said that the war will continue and that the Russians are focused on the war and are focused mostly on achieving victory in that war. Now, I ought to say that there are reports that on the 8th of September, the Europeans and the Americans are going to have yet another meeting with each other. And this time, apparently, they're going to discuss sanctions and steps that might be taken by the Americans and the Europeans to try to increase the economic pressure on Russia, to impose more sanctions, more tariffs, do all of those sort of things. Well, Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, has now made, in some ways, a rather Interesting comment. I suspect he was rather sad in making it, but he acknowledged, over the course of this comment, he acknowledged that Europe has basically run out of tools it can use to pressure Russia. All its sanctions, all the 18 packages of sanctions have failed to achieve any effect. The Russian economy is still there. It's still expanding, by the way. It's still standing. There's a debate going on currently in Russia between the central bank and various ministries, the economics ministry again, but other players within the Russian economy, as to how rapidly interest rates should be cut. Vladimir Putin said that the central bank should be very cautious in cutting interest rates. Interestingly, the head of Russia's biggest bank, German Gref, former economics minister in Putin's government, he's now come out and said that the central bank needs to cut interest rates more aggressively. And he says that he wants interest rates to go down to 12% by year end. Currently, just to say, they are at 18%. So he wants a reduction of 6% in the rate of interest before the end of the year. So anyway, that debate goes on. It's an interesting debate, interesting for people like me who take an interest in where the Russian economy is going. But the point is that the economy is stable, inflation is coming down, there's some telltale indicators that growth is returning. The PMI reports show what appears to be gradually recovering sentiment. It looks like, as I said, the economy is stable and is probably likely before long to return to growth as inflation continues to fall. Meanwhile, as we have also seen, Russia's big trading partners, China, India, the others, continue to stand by Russia. The Indian finance minister has just made further comments about Indian oil purchases of Russian oil. He said that India will continue to buy Russian oil because it is in its economic and financial interests to do so. And that is the end of the discussion. The Indians are not going to review or change their approach here. And as I've discussed already, China having over the course of the last week inked a massive gas deal with Russia, Power of Siberia 2, is not going to reverse course on its purchases of Russian oil and gas. And as it showed in the spring, it has the potential for massive retaliation against the United States and the Western economies if they dare try to impose sanctions or tariffs against it. So, given that this is so, the whole debate about sanctions and tariffs ought logically to have lost its meaning. And you might think that Friedrich Merz, whose popularity, by the way, I understand, continues to fall in Germany. Anyway, it might be the case, you might expect, that after comments like that, after the comments that he's made, admitting that the Europeans have run out of road, the point has been reached for a rethink, if not for ending the sanctions. That's probably politically impossible at the present time. That would be a massive admission of failure, and no European government, having made these colossal mistakes, would be prepared to admit to them in a way that would probably trigger its collapse. Anyway, at least Merz and the others, following Merz's logic, might do that which people who find themselves in trouble are often advised to do, namely, since they're in a hole, stop digging. But no, Merz doesn't follow that logic at all. Europe must still go ahead with its 19th sanctions package, which will not be a sanctions package against Russia, actually. It looks like it's going to be a sanctions package against India and perhaps China too, just saying, even though neither of these countries, certainly not India, is directly involved in the Ukraine conflict. I mean, there's been a constant narrative in the West that India is supplying dual-use technologies to Russia and all kinds of things, and it's supporting Russia and it's assisting in all kinds of indirect ways the Russian military in its war against Ukraine. There's this narrative all the time. But nobody that I know is suggesting that India is doing that. And yet we see that India is going to be subjected to sanctions because it is doing the entirely legal thing, which is to buy Russian oil, something which it was originally encouraged to do by the United States and the European countries themselves in order to keep the price of oil stable. I mean, it is extraordinary, but anyway, this is what Merz wants to see happen. He accepts that sanctions, tariffs by the Europeans can't achieve any effect, but he says that, and he laments this, that Europe is dependent on the Americans. It is the Americans who must now come forward and take the decisive action that is going to change Russia's strategic calculus. He laments the fact, he says that it's a real shame and a great problem that Europe is so dependent on the United States. He says that even though, of course, Merz is exactly one of the leaders of Europe who is working round the clock to make Europe even more dependent on the United States, who supports massive, unbalanced trade deals with the United States, like the one that Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump agreed with each other a short time ago in Scotland. It's Merz also who wants to buy more weapons from the United States, not just for Ukraine now, but for Germany apparently as well. So Merz laments Europe's dependence on the United States, oblivious to the fact that he is making Europe more dependent on the United States. But anyway, he now says, and it's clearly said in anticipation of this meeting on Monday, that this is the moment, to be correct, on Monday, that this is the moment for the Americans to come forward, to do what they must, to bring the Russians to heel, to impose these massive sanctions upon the Russians, to actually do things that will finally, conclusively force the Russians to the negotiating table and oblige them to accept the package that the coalition of the willing pretended to adopt in Paris, but which the Americans have not actually publicly so far endorsed. And by the way, going back to that article in the Telegraph by David Blair, you will see that he says there the same thing, that it is Donald Trump who, through his extraordinary indulgence of Vladimir Putin, his unwillingness to take decisive action against the Russians in the sanctions wars, it is Donald Trump who is somehow to blame for the whole problem, for the fact that the Russians have not been brought to heel. He's been putting pressure on the wrong party, on Ukraine. He ought to be putting pressure on Russia. Again, it's frustrating to see these comments made in Europe, in Britain, and in Germany. This agitation, this pressure on the Americans to take these extraordinary steps, to go forward with the bone-crushing sanctions that Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal in the Senate are talking about, apparently oblivious to the realities of how the world is changing, even though those changes were on public display in Tianjin and Beijing last week. But no, one doesn't pay any attention to that. One still assumes that the United States is the hyperpower, that it has the power to do pretty much anything that it wants. All Donald Trump needs to do is push the button or press the lever, and Vladimir Putin will see his entire economy collapse like a house of cards and will either be brought to heel or, better still, will be overthrown. The inability to see the world as it really is of intelligent people continues to baffle me. But anyway, let's actually discuss what the Americans are really going to come up with when they meet the Europeans on the 8th of September. The Wall Street Journal says that over the course of the discussion between Donald Trump and the Europeans, the one that took place after the Coalition of the Willing meeting, the one where the Europeans discovered to their dismay that Donald Trump was not prepared to spell out in any detail security guarantees or backstops or anything at all of that kind. The Wall Street Journal says that Donald Trump was also very unwilling or very vague about sanctions. He didn't commit to any further sanctions against anyone at all. As I said in my program yesterday, what he did was that he diverted the whole discussion to the fact that the Europeans continue to buy oil from India, which is refined oil imported previously by India as crude oil from Russia. And the Europeans apparently came away dismayed and frustrated by this. Well, maybe Donald Trump will impose some further sanctions on the Russians. It seems likely. I mean, we've been here before. But after the commitments that India and China have both made, why does anybody believe that it's going to make any substantive difference to what the Russians are going to do? And if we catapult ourselves back into an all-out economic war with China, like the one that we had in the spring, I predict that it will only continue for a few weeks before there is a crisis, an emerging crisis in the American and European economies. And bear in mind, the European economies are already in increasingly bad shape. And there are the first telltale signs that the American economy is now slowing rapidly. The latest jobs print, not that I pay much attention to those, suggests a steady decline in economic activity in the United States. Anyway, this is hardly the right moment to launch another economic war against China, and I predict that before very long, in a matter of weeks probably, there would be a dramatic reverse, and the United States would have to do what it did back in the spring, which is find some way of reversing what it had done and looked for some means to ease off on the sanctions and the tariffs against China that as part of this economic war it might be seeking to impose. This, as I said, seems to me an extraordinary, baffling set of demands. And I think that in their own best interests, in order to avoid this kind of scenario, the Americans should finally be straightforward the administration should finally be straightforward with both the Europeans and with the hardliners amongst them, with the Senate, with Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal specifically. They should say to these people, look, the United States has already tried to tariff India, effectively sanction India for buying Russian oil, and that has turned into a massive diplomatic debacle. We see India reaffirming its commitment to buy Russian oil, attending high-level meetings in China, inviting none other than Vladimir Putin to visit India as well. And by the way, and for the record, just as I expected and have been saying throughout this year, that I expected that it would be this year that the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline project would be signed by China and Russia. So I think it is highly likely that when Putin visits India and meets with Modi in December, the Russians and the Indians are going to sign off on another big project, and that is for joint development and purchase by India of Russia's fifth generation fighter jet, the Sukhoi 57. Now, the Indians, I say this because the Indians have been offered the F-35 by the United States for various reasons, nothing to do, as I understand it, with the technical issues relating to this plane. It's apparent, well, some claim its lack of effectiveness. Others say that it is enormously effective. I'm not going to get into that discussion. But what concerns the Indians about it is that the F-35 comes with all kinds of strings attached. The United States is unwilling to share critically important technologies with India, and apparently will insist on restrictions on its use. Russian military packages extending back, in the case of India, to the 1960s, come both with industrial partnership agreements, which have significantly assisted India in building up its military-industrial complex and indeed its bigger industrial economy, but are also much, much more flexible in allowing India use. There is a further factor, by the way, and I'm not sure how important this is, but as I understand it, during the brief clash between India and Pakistan a few months ago, the Indians found that the Chinese-supplied fighter jets that Pakistan deployed against them were both effective, and that the long-range missiles, the Chinese-built long-range missiles, air-to-air missiles that the Pakistanis also had, were more effective still. The Indians found, by contrast, that their Western-supplied fighter jets did not have such long-range missiles. The Russians do have long-range missiles, air-to-air missiles. They've been using them very effectively in Ukraine itself. And more importantly, the Indians also apparently were very happy with the performance of their S-400 air defense system. In fact, Modi was briefly photographed after the war alongside the S-400, indicating how pleased the Indians were with it. Whereas I understand from Indian reports and sources that the Indians feel that Pakistan's China-supplied air defense missiles proved less effective than the Indian ones were, and proved unable to defeat Indian missiles. Well, I want to stress I am talking about what I've heard and read. I'm not saying that any of this is necessarily true. But the very fact that all of this rhetoric is being, all of this, these articles are appearing and these commentaries are appearing in the Indian media about the effectiveness of the S-400 system, some of the problems that both Pakistan and some of the Western fighter jets had, supplied fighter jets had. All of that leads me to think that a big arms agreement is on the horizon. And I'm going to guess it's going to involve Sukhoi 57 fighter jets and quite possibly additional deliveries of S-400 air defense missiles. Just to say. Anyway, the point is that the meeting, the attempt to pressure India has proved a debacle. Instead of causing India to distance itself from Russia, India has got closer to Russia. Instead of creating differences, intensifying differences between India and the other BRICS countries, Modi conspicuously went to the events in China and appears to be pursuing a policy of détente with the Chinese. And as I've said, quite plausibly, even as the Americans and the Europeans have some kind of meeting on Monday, we're going to see, perhaps even on Monday, an emergency meeting of the BRICS held in the format of a video conference, and I'm fairly confident that this will be an economics-focused meeting intended to look for ways to counter the tariff and economic pressure that the United States and the other Western countries have been trying to impose on individual BRICS states. Now, before I proceed here, there is something further I wanted to discuss, which is this idea that the Chinese floated and which has now been adopted to create a bank, a development bank, within the framework of the SCO. And I said that this is surprising to me because there is already a BRICS bank in existence which already fulfills that kind of role. And I said that I wondered whether this new SCO bank, its purpose might be to finance military developments and military production in various SCO states. Well, that might still be true, but what I've subsequently learned is that the BRICS Bank, in order to attract participation from Western-oriented states, the BRICS Bank apparently follows Western sanctions. So it cannot have dealings with Russia, for example. I suspect that the SCO Bank will operate entirely outside the Western financial system and will not follow Western sanctions and could be instrumental, for example, in Russian-Chinese trade, but also perhaps trade with other BRICS states and SCO states that might also find themselves under sanctions pressure, such as Iran and, of course, now India. Just saying. Anyway, so coming back to all of this, the attempt to pressure India was a complete debacle. So why try this with an even more formidable, if not a far more formidable adversary, which is China? It absolutely makes no sense to me. It is absurd. It is ridiculous. It is going round and round in a circle. And that is exactly where they're going to end up. And I'm going to suggest that the Americans, who I think do have some better understanding of this, will probably resist some of these ideas from the Europeans. But, as I said, the time has come. Indeed, it is long overdue for the Americans, for the administration, for Rubio and Besant and Lutnick and all of them, finally to have that straightforward, frank talk, both with their European allies and with the hardliners in Washington, and say to them, look, what you are proposing, an economic blockade of Russia, cannot be done. The world has changed. We no longer have the power that we once did. It might have been possible in, say, 2000, but it is not possible anymore. All we do when we try to do these things is that we isolate ourselves from key parts of the world. We weaken the credibility of our own financial system as the global financial system. And since the Americans are so fixated on their rivalry with China, we enhance China's position. We make China specifically stronger and ourselves weaker. And if we are catapulted over the next few weeks or months into a full-blown crisis in our manufacturing industry and in our broader economies, because we have relaunched an economic war against China, which the events of the spring showed we cannot win, well, then we are not only calling our own bluff, but we're doing something much, much worse. We are highlighting, we are telling the rest of the world that it is China actually that is now the pivotal economic country and no longer ourselves. Now, I understand why it is very difficult in the United States to hold these conversations, and perhaps especially difficult for this president to do so, given the value he places on American strength. But if these conversations cannot be conducted in public, and perhaps it's better that they are not, at least not for the moment, I personally think that the American people are tough-minded enough and strong-minded enough to listen to all of this and to accept it. But I can understand why there are others in the United States who might think otherwise. The point I'm making is that if you can't conduct these conversations publicly in that way, then do so at least in private. Do so in that meeting on the 8th of September, and do so in discussions, the private discussions taking place between the administration and the Senate. If you want proof of how counterproductive this attempt to sanction and tariff Russia's trading partners are, then just look at the Indian debacle and you will see it all there. Now, I ought to say that there's an interesting article in The Guardian today, and I have heard this from other sources too, that the events in China over the last week have spooked some people in the United States. Certainly, they seem to have had an effect on the president himself. I discussed that Truth Social post that he published a few days ago, in which he talked about how the United States has lost Russia and India to deep, dark China. By the way, the Russians have pushed back on that. They say that they were never the United States' to lose, and that Russia absolutely has not closed its doors to the United States. It still wants a good cooperative relationship with the United States and with all countries, including eventually, in time, the European countries. The Russians, Putin himself, over the course of his speech in the Far East, said that Russia remains open. It is not retreating into self-sufficiency and autarky and anything of that kind. It's happy to trade and deal on a fair and equal basis with all countries, east, west, north or south. And I think when the Russians say that, they mean it, by the way. So I don't think that the Americans are right at all when they say that Russia and India have committed themselves to some kind of Chinese project. I don't actually believe that there is a Chinese project, at least not in the way that some people in Washington imagine. I don't believe that the Chinese have any aspiration to become the world's dominant power, at least not in the way that the United States once was, because I think that this is contrary to China's history, and I don't believe anyway that China has that level of resources, just to say. But anyway, I understand that that is what some people in America believe. They are convinced that some kind of sinister alliance of great powers is assembling now against them. I think that on that, by the way, that if Donald Trump had gone to Beijing and had met with some of these leaders, had met with Modi there maybe, and Xi Jinping, and even with Putin again, whom he is going to speak to again on the phone fairly soon, or so he says. Anyway, I think that if Trump had gone, as I think he should have done, I appreciate that there are enormous political risks and challenges to doing that. I think if he'd gone to Beijing, a lot of these American worries would have been allayed. And in fact, had Trump gone, he would have been the main guest of honor. He would have, Putin, of course, would still have been a guest of honor, but Trump would have been the most visible and important one, and more likely than not, it would he who have been on Xi Jinping's right side during the celebrations, and Putin would then have been on the Xi Jinping's left side during the celebrations. But anyway, put all of that aside, it seems that some people in the United States, looking at these events, have been dismayed by them, and that there is worry and recrimination and concern. Well, perhaps these worries are to some extent misplaced, but they're still better, I think, than the arrogant complacency of people like Lindsey Graham and the neocons and people like Friedrich Merz in Europe, who still seem to think that more sanctions, more tariffs on the Russians and on their trading partners is the way to go. I hope that the United States will dodge this bullet again. Donald Trump, if he has shown nothing else, it's a facility, an ability to do that. My own view is that the reason why he's now talking about speaking to Putin again is that he wants to give himself another reason, following another successful and productive telephone call with Putin, another reason to put off imposing these massive tariffs and sanctions, which he, if no one else in Washington, clearly does recognize was a terrible mistake. Anyway, one thing I do have to say, and that is that I do wonder whether some people in Europe can ever be convinced, will ever be convinced, that there is any degree of limit to American power, and who can ever be convinced that some kind of diplomatic engagement with the Russians, some acceptance of the realities, the actual material realities, can ever take place. I have to say that over the last couple of days, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas, has surpassed even herself in terms of her own bizarre behavior. She made comments about basically casting doubt about whether China and Russia were truly the winners of the Second World War. An extraordinary thing to say, an indicator of a complete failure to understand history, and by the way, one which a Baltic politician in particular, for all sorts of reasons, historic reasons, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. Anyway, a Baltic politician, I would have thought, would want especially to avoid getting drawn into. Anyway, this provoked a response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. I am not going to read it, but basically what it amounted to is the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the Chinese government, in other words, essentially saying that Kaja Kallas is a fool. So, there we are. Now, if that is not bad enough, I think that these incredibly crass comments about who were the winners in the Second World War have now been surpassed by further comments that Kaja Kallas made of an unbelievably incoherent and rambling nature, disjointed, bizarre. I was unable to understand a certain amount of what she was saying, which, given what I did understand, it appeared to be about the proclivities of different nations, probably is just as well. Anyway, I have to say that these strange musings seem to me completely detached from what a diplomat, the senior diplomat of the European Union, ought to be saying or discussing. It is well past time that the European Council, that European leaders finally got to grips with this problem, which is Kaja Kallas, and recognized that this person simply is not able to do that which she has been appointed to do. I used to consider Annalena Baerbock, the former Foreign Minister of Germany, incompetent and at times bizarre. David Lammy, I talked about earlier in this program. But I have to say, Kaja Kallas sets a standard all of her own. Anyway, I'm now going to turn briefly to a recap of the situation on the battlefronts, because there's been an awful lot more news over the last 24 hours. And to go back to something that Putin was saying, we're talking about now the Ukrainian battlefront. It seems that the Russian advance continues, and continues in all directions and in all places. The Russian army apparently, there is now conclusive video footage showing not only from the Russians, showing the Russian army deep inside Kupiansk, in fact, in the central areas of Kupiansk, but the Ukrainians themselves have now released video footage showing the Ukrainian military conducting FPV drone attacks on Russian soldiers inside Kupiansk, which of course confirms that the Russians do now indeed control Kupiansk. So this battle is developing exactly as the chief of the General Staff of Russia, General Gerasimov, said a few days ago. The Russians are indeed inside Kupiansk. There might be some argument about whether they control half of it. Some are putting it at less, 30 or 25%. I go with Gerasimov. I suspect it is more than half now. But of course, to say it again, I am not there. So it may be that some of the doubts are true, but there is no doubt that the Russians are indeed fighting deep inside Kupiansk. Now, I don't know how much longer this battle will continue. The various mapping projects, I noticed, have adjusted the maps around Kupiansk. There was lots of talk about Ukrainian counterattacks in Kupiansk, putting the Russian positions in jeopardy there. I always thought those counterattacks probably had little reality to them, and I noticed that the mapping projects have now returned all of the territory that the Ukrainians claim to have recaptured back under Russian control. So Kupiansk is effectively surrounded. The Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk are effectively surrounded. I understand that there is still access for the Ukrainians to Kupiansk through some difficult to use country roads. The Russians, presumably, are operating drones and other things, interrupting Ukrainian movements along these roads, resupply. Probably the Ukrainians can withdraw still from Kupiansk, and I absolutely think that that is what they should do. And I thought about a week ago that that was probably what they would do. But again, I overestimated the ability of Zelensky and Syrskyi to make what seemed to me the correct decisions, and instead they have continued with their usual policy of insisting that their soldiers defend what is undefendable ground, in effect, to the last man. So I suspect that eventually resistance in Kupiansk will collapse and the town will fall, and that the Ukrainians, who are already short of men, are going to find that they've lost more men to no useful purpose. Anyway, that's Kupiansk. There's been more reports of further Russian advances in both the Liman and Siversk areas. Of course, Gerasimov says that there's already fighting going on inside Siversk, but there has so far been no video footage to confirm this. This is the only claim so far that Gerasimov made, of which we have seen no visual proof. But it is nonetheless undoubtedly the case that the Russians are continuing to capture ground and villages around Siversk. They seem to be capturing more villages from the south in territory which previously, by the way, the Ukrainians had unflinchingly defended. Now the Russians are able to advance north towards Siversk along the railway lines and the roads. And my impression is that Ukrainian resistance is becoming more disorganized and weaker as the Russian vice around Siversk closes. And it also seems that the Russians have advanced closer, much closer, to Liman, the city immediately to the west of Siversk, the town immediately to the west of Siversk as well. Now, Kupiansk, Siversk, Liman are all places that were either recaptured by the Ukrainians as part of their Kharkov 2022, autumn 2022 counteroffensive, or which were important for the Ukrainians in the connection with that offensive. And it has always seemed to me that the objective of the Russians in capturing these three places, Siversk, Liman and Kupiansk, is to reverse all Ukrainian gains during that offensive in order to commence an encirclement of Slavyansk, the northern town of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. From the north, even as Russian pressure on Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk prepares the ground for an encirclement of the same conurbation from the south. And importantly and interestingly, it looks like the Russians are working now in the air towards that objective as well, because there are reports that they're starting to conduct drone attacks on the main roads leading to all of these places, Liman and Kupiansk, but they're also attacking road links closer to Izium, and indeed between Izium and Slavyansk, which Izium being the town which the Ukrainians recaptured in autumn 2022, and which, after the Russians have captured Kupiansk, Liman and Siversk, I think they will make their priority to recapture. Now, the point is that if you look at the road system leading to this conurbation, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, there are two road systems that lead to it, two major supply routes. One was from the west and the south, and it passed through Pokrovsk. There was a whole network of roads and railway lines that went through Pokrovsk and which enabled the Ukrainians to keep their forces in the Donbass cities supplied. The other set of roads and railway lines came from the north through this town of Izium. If the Russians capture both Izium and Pokrovsk, all of the major supply routes to Slavyansk, Kramatorsk will have been cut. And I spoke about how the Russians, if they capture Pokrovsk, will be in a position to conduct an outflanking operation, in effect surrounding Slavyansk, the Ukrainian grouping in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And, well, one can see how the fall of Siversk, Liman, Kupiansk could lead to an attack on Izium, an attempt to recapture Izium, and how these two objectives all dovetail with each other. And I would suggest that the drone attacks on the Izium-Slavyansk road and other drone attacks by the Russians in the same territory point to this being the medium-term Russian objective. Now that brings me to battles that are taking place in other places. Now, Gerasimov a few days ago during his presentation also said that the Russians are in control of a large belt of territory north of Chasiv Yar, which they have recently captured, and immediately to the east of Kramatorsk, the biggest of these cities in the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation, the place where the Ukrainian headquarters in Donbass is located, and also the central one of them. Now, there had been no information about this before from the various mapping projects, but we're now starting to get information that appears to corroborate what Gerasimov is saying. because the Russians have now announced that one of the villages, precisely in this area, has now been captured by the Russians, and there are reports that another village has also been captured. This brings the Russians right up to the eastern outskirts of Kramatorsk itself, and it also means that the Russians hold a belt of territory which, if they want to cut the supply lines from Kramatorsk south to Konstantinovka, would enable them to do so. We are starting to see the first telltale signs of an encirclement of Konstantinovka being underway. Konstantinovka is now mainly supplied by the Ukrainians from Kramatorsk. The Russians have already captured strong positions to the west of Konstantinovka, from which they can threaten the roads leading to Konstantinovka from Kramatorsk, and they're now positioned to the east as well. A complete encirclement of Konstantinovka is now starting to shape up. Now, Redovka, the Russian magazine based in Smolensk, newspaper, I should say, not magazine, which has lots of information about the battlefronts, is now claiming that the Ukrainians are understanding the crisis, that they are pulling out all of the stops to try to push the Russians back in the area of the Russian breakthrough, the area where the Russians broke through in August, northeast of Pokrovsk. And Redovka says that the Ukrainians are in the process of conducting a counterattack, a big counterattack, trying to cut off this breakthrough area at its root by attacking towards the village of Nikatorovka, which the Russians captured also in August. However, Redovka is saying that so far this counterattack has failed. But they say that this is the biggest and most important battle taking place on the battlefields at the moment. It seems confident that the Russians will hold, and it expects this battle to be ended within about 3 days, because it says that the burn rate of the Ukrainian brigades that are conducting this counterattack is so high that they will not be able to sustain it for longer than that. My own view is that if Redovka is publishing that kind of information about this counterattack, which I'm confident is indeed taking place, then Redovka is confident that this counterattack will fail. South and within Pokrovsk itself, the story is of Russian advances. The Ukrainians have now released footage of drone attacks on Russian troops in Udachny, southwest of Pokrovsk, which to my mind confirms conclusively that the Russians are indeed in control of Udachny. There are reports that the Russians are slowly enlarging the territory that they control in Pokrovsk itself, and in the southern area, in Mirnograd, southern Novoekonomichny, where the Ukrainians also attempted a counterattack. It's been attributed by some Ukrainian commanders to an over-ambitious Ukrainian brigade chief. Some Ukrainian channels, to an over-ambitious brigade commander of the Ukrainian army. Anyway, the reports say that this counterattack has now been completely repulsed, and all of the territory that the Ukrainians recaptured during that counterattack is now once again firmly under Russian control. We see that the Russian pressure is growing, And obviously this is a siege. The Russians are besieging the Ukrainian line, which is made up of these four towns: Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Pokrovsk. But with every day, the line further cracks, even as the Ukrainians have to deploy more and more forces to try to hold their positions, with the burn rate of their brigades, as Gerasimov and Putin have just said, intensifying. That, it seems to me, is the story of the battle. You won't find any of this in the media in the West. The narrative today is that the situation is stable, that there's been no significant change on the front lines at all. By the end of this year, my expectation is that this will be an impossible claim to sustain any longer. And I do wonder what people will be saying in the West at that time. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you all that you can find all my programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. In the meantime, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this video if you've liked this video. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.